He was never supposed to matter this much, yet I remember every shirt I washed, every bill I covered, every time I skipped a meal so he could eat before studying. We weren't official, just entangled in the kind of way that doesn't come with titles, only expectations. He'd leave notes on my nightstand with legal terms I didn't understand, talked about passing the bar like it was our shared dream, not just his. I believed in his potential more than he did, and when the acceptance letter came, it was my account that paid the deposit. He never offered. My mother didn't approve, said men with ambition forget the women who hold them together, said I should be careful with the way I kept giving. She never yelled, never cursed, just smiled too tightly whenever he walked into a room. I brushed it off, told myself she didn't understand our generation, didn't get how partnerships worked now. She'd look at him the way older women look at expensive cars they know they can't afford, and he'd ignore her, or at least pretend to. At the time, I thought I was being paranoid, but she was just patient. He wasn't rich, but he wore struggle like a suit, pressed and prepared. That's what made people trust him. He didn't hide his past, he edited it, made it clean enough to sell. His father was gone, his mother worked in retail, and somehow that turned him into a future senator in everyone's eyes. I introduced him to my family, helped him draft his first resume, sat in coffee shops editing cover letters while he played politics over lattes. He told me I was the only real thing in his life, that he couldn't imagine doing it without me. When he got accepted into the law program, we stayed up all night talking about what it would mean, not just for him, but for us. He said things like, "We're going to make it, and we'll remember this struggle one day," and I believed him, because when you want someone to win, you convince yourself you're part of the prize. The tuition came with a deadline, and I drained my savings to meet it. He said he'd pay me back when he made it. I didn't ask for a timeline. I didn't need one. That was the mistake. He moved into student housing, said it would be easier to focus, and I understood, or at least pretended I did. The calls slowed down. The texts became shorter. I chalked it up to stress, exams, the weight of becoming someone. I still brought him food on Sundays, still showed up for his mock trials, still carried hope like it was a full-time job. Then, one Friday night, I called him and got voicemail. By Monday, his number was disconnected. I went to his building and found it empty. His roommates said he transferred schools. I wasn't informed. I went home to my mother, shaken and raw, hoping for something soft. She acted surprised, said maybe it wasn't personal, that he was probably overwhelmed. She offered me tea in silence, the kind that stretches too long. I didn't see the red flags then, just shadows I mistook for comfort. 2 weeks later, I saw a post online, just a glimpse, his face in a family photo I didn't recognize, surrounded by people in tailored clothes. He was smiling, clean-cut, standing behind my mother, one hand on her shoulder. The caption read, "My future stepson-in-law." I remember thinking it was a joke, some bizarre family prank. Then the invitations came, gold-trimmed, hand-delivered, with both their names etched in cursive. My mother acted like I was overreacting, said they connected unexpectedly, that love doesn't always follow rules. She said I should be happy for them, that I had my own life to focus on. She didn't apologize. He didn't either. They just stood there in our living room, asking for understanding like they hadn't burned the entire foundation underneath me. I left before they could finish explaining, before I said something unforgivable. I didn't speak to either of them again. Not when the wedding made headlines. Not when mutual friends whispered apologies they didn't know. I took what I had left and disappeared from that life entirely. I moved cities, changed my number, finished my own education. I never looked back, not because I was healed, but because looking back meant accepting what I'd lost. By the time his name returned to my desk years later, printed across a fraud indictment and facing 10 years federal, I didn't flinch. Some names don't sting anymore, they just signal closure. The wedding happened in spring, when the air still felt clean and the sky hadn't learned how to lie yet. I didn't attend, but photos found me anyway, filtered, glossy everywhere. They looked like a catalog couple, like Betrayal couldn't exist in their orbit. My mother wore a sleeveless gown with my favorite earrings, the ones she swore didn't suit her. He stood beside her like he'd never borrowed my dreams, like he'd never begged for train fare in the middle of the night. He kissed her hand in one shot, the same way he used to kiss my ankle. People sent messages, some out of confusion, others out of cruelty. Old friends asked if it was true, if the man I put through law school really married the woman who raised me. I answered no one. There's nothing to say when the punchline is your life. My mother stopped trying to explain after a while, stopped offering her justifications wrapped in phrases like fate and God's timing. They moved into a house with a garden I helped her pay for, hired decorators to make it look like she hadn't spent her youth pawning jewelry to cover our rent. He got work through her contacts, private firms, clean offices, handshake promotions. Nobody asked about his past because she cleaned it for him. She repackaged his story into something palatable, a man rebuilt by love and discipline. He gave interviews about resilience, about overcoming hardship, without once mentioning who covered his hardship's bills. I watched it unfold from a distance, not with bitterness, but with a quiet understanding that some people grow into the lie if you let them wear it long enough. They stopped being people I knew. They became brands, and I stopped reading their label. My father, distant and disengaged as always, didn't say much about the wedding. When I finally heard from him, he asked if I was over it. I didn't answer. There's no unit of time that measures betrayal, no milestone that tells you you're healed. The silence between us stretched, brittle and sharp. Eventually, he changed the subject to taxes. I realized then that I was done explaining myself to people who only cared about recovery when it came with neat timelines. I deleted his number after that call. Family, I learned, is not always blood sometimes, it's just noise. I moved to a smaller city, closer to the coast, where people didn't know my name or who I used to love. I enrolled in night classes, cleaned houses during the day, and built a new life piece by piece. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I didn't tell anyone about my past, didn't mention the money I lost or the names that left scars. I became the woman people went to for help, for clarity, for structure. I liked that. It made me feel like I hadn't wasted everything. Like maybe losing everything gave me something clean to hold. 3 years passed before I applied to law school. Not to prove anything. Not even to win. I just wanted to know what it felt like to build without owing. I studied alone, saved every spare dollar, passed each semester without shortcuts. There were nights I thought about him, not with longing, but with curiosity. I wondered if he still used the same opening line, if he remembered how I taught him to write briefs in the voice of someone who had nothing left to lose. I never tried to find out. I'd already given him too much of me. When I graduated, I didn't throw a party. I walked across the stage in secondhand shoes, shook hands with people who didn't know my story, and tucked my diploma into a manila envelope. I kept working, passed the bar, opened a small firm with 2 friends who believed in quiet power. We didn't advertise, didn't chase prestige. We just handled cases that mattered: debt relief, eviction defense, immigration hold releases. My name was finally mine, not attached to someone else's rise or collapse. I wasn't waiting to be seen. I had become the person people looked for in a storm. Then his name came back to me, wrapped in headlines and panic. A federal investigation into one of the city's largest legal funds, tied to fraudulent disbursements and forged signatures. His name wasn't central, not yet, but it was mentioned once, buried halfway through an article. I stared at it for a long time, not out of revenge, but because it looked unfamiliar in that font. His face showed up next. Older, heavier, thinner around the eyes. The article said he'd be indicted within the month. I read it twice, closed the tab, and returned to work. People fall. That part's not new. The wedding photos didn't sting as much as the silence that followed, the way everyone I used to trust shifted their loyalty without hesitation. Cousins I grew up with posted congratulations beneath her bridal portraits. Friends I lent rent money to shared clips of the first dance with soft music and softer words. Nobody asked where I was. Nobody cared what came before the cake. It felt like my entire history had been overwritten in cursive on the back of an invitation I never received. They weren't just pretending to be happy for her, they were pretending I'd never existed. My stepmother played the role beautifully. She called it destiny, said they fell in love unexpectedly, like it was a car crash no one could avoid. But she had always been theatrical, knew exactly how to cry without smearing mascara, how to hold a man's hand in public while digging claws into his future behind the scenes. She made herself the victim, the lucky second chance, the woman who turned a young man's ambition into a legacy. What no one knew was how many doors she closed on my behalf to keep herself the center of every room we shared. She'd rewritten her will a month before the wedding. I wasn't supposed to find out, but my aunt accidentally forwarded the wrong email thread. Suddenly, the inheritance my father left for me became joint assets, tied up in trusts and legal phrasing meant to look generous. They called it restructuring, said it was cleaner this way. I knew better. I knew her lawyer, I knew the timing, and I knew she'd been waiting for an excuse to claim everything she once told me I didn't appreciate. Marrying him gave her the perfect one. Now she had the story, the sympathy, and the paper trail. I remember sitting at my old kitchen table, reading legal terms I'd once skipped over, feeling like I was drowning in my own house. They didn't take the property, not officially, but they replaced the locks, changed the curtains, repainted the front door. He parked in the driveway like he'd always belonged there, carried groceries through a home I helped pay for. Neighbors waved. She smiled. I watched from a borrowed car across the street, not to stalk, but to see what erasure looked like in real time. It wasn't loud or cruel. It was elegant and practiced, like a routine. My father's side said nothing. Some of them whispered that I should move on, start fresh, not let it ruin me. They spoke like pain was optional, like grief had an expiration date. I stopped answering messages, stopped picking up unknown numbers. Isolation felt cleaner than pity. I sold what I had left town without forwarding my mail, and started over somewhere people didn't ask questions. When people asked why I left, I said it was time for something new. I never mentioned the man, the marriage, or the mother who wore my name like a discarded coat. At first, rebuilding felt like climbing through water, heavy, slow, impossible to breathe. But eventually, rhythm returned. I found work, met people who saw me without looking for my past. I didn't talk much about where I came from, and no one pressed. I liked that. I learned how to fade into my own skin, how to build without broadcasting. Law school came quietly, passed in chapters of exhaustion and small victories. I paid my own way, one class at a time. There were no speeches, no promises, just a steady march toward something they couldn't touch. When I opened my practice, I didn't invite anyone from the old life. No cousins, no childhood friends, no one who smiled at both weddings. It wasn't spite, it was clarity. The fewer people who knew my beginning, the less they could sabotage the ending. We handled difficult cases, complicated clients, and always left our names off the headlines. I had peace, not applause. And that was enough. I thought I had escaped it all, outgrown the mess, until one day, his name returned, not in gossip, but in paperwork. Bold font. Black ink. Indictment. I read it like scripture. He was facing fraud charges, tied to a client trust fund that had been drained over years. The numbers didn't add up, the records were altered, and his name was scattered across the ledgers like fingerprints. He wasn't the only one under investigation, but he was the one they wanted to make an example of. His career was over, his firm was folding, and suddenly, everyone who once toasted to his success was whispering his downfall like a prayer. I watched it unfold quietly, not with satisfaction, but with the calm detachment of someone who already knew the ending. By the time I was asked to review the file, I had already seen his downfall unravel in real time, one article at a time, one name at a time. But this wasn't gossip anymore. It was formal. A federal request for counsel review had landed on my desk, and somehow, the universe made sure it came to me. The file was thick, held together with rusted clips and a yellow sticky note that read, "Sensitive, discretion advised." I didn't ask how or why it found me. I just opened it, read the first page, and didn't blink. His mugshot sat on top, blurry, but recognizable. The man who once said I was the only person who truly saw him was now wearing an orange jumpsuit and a stare that didn't reach the camera. The charges were laid out in clean legal terms: wire fraud, embezzlement, obstruction. Dozens of clients were involved, their funds rerouted, stolen, erased. The trail was messy but deliberate, and his signature appeared in all the wrong places. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel pity. Just an odd sense of distance, like reading about someone I'd only imagined. He was being held without bail pending trial. The court had assigned him a provisional defense team, but he'd filed a motion to speak with alternate representation. That's why my name was on the list. He had requested a meeting. Said he knew someone who could help. The name wasn't mine directly, but the firm was. He still didn't know I was behind it. I stared at the request for a long time, fingers tight around the edge of the folder. I should have declined. I should have passed it on. Instead, I said yes without thinking twice. We scheduled the meeting. A courthouse, late afternoon, no press allowed. When I entered the room, he was already seated, hands cuffed loosely, suit wrinkled and misplaced like a borrowed memory. He looked up and, for a second, nothing changed. No recognition. Just politeness. Then it hit him slowly, like smoke. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound followed. I sat down across from him, placed the file between us, and said nothing. He tried to smile. I didn't. He leaned forward, whispered my name like a question. I didn't confirm. I didn't deny. I simply opened the file. I didn't know you were here, he said, voice hoarse, eyes scanning mine for softness. I didn't know you'd become this. He looked smaller than I remembered, as if his choices had started caving in on him. I told him we were here to discuss legal strategy, not the past. He asked if I hated him. I said this wasn't personal. I could feel him flinch, but he kept the performance going, the wide-eyed sorrow, the regret wrapped in confusion. I offered him the deal the DA was pushing: plead guilty, serve a reduced sentence, avoid trial. His hands trembled. He asked if I believed he did it. I told him belief wasn't required in court. Only evidence. He said it wasn't like it looked, that he'd been set up, that the pressure got to him. He mentioned my mother, called her his wife, like that meant something now. Said she'd left him, emptied the accounts, vanished without warning. I almost smiled. Almost. He said he thought of me often, that if he could go back, he would have done everything differently. He sounded sincere, like a man finally facing himself. He took the plea deal. Signed it. Said thank you. That should have been the end. A signature. A sentence. Closure. But the next morning, his name was all over the news again. This time, not for fraud, but for slander. He leaked a story to a local outlet, claimed I was targeting him out of personal vengeance, said I was emotionally compromised, and had manipulated the case against him. He painted himself as the victim, called me a scorned ex with a grudge, twisted the story until I was the villain and he the ruined man. He'd taken the mercy I gave him and weaponized it like a shield. I stared at the article on my screen, reading the headline over and over. My phone buzzed with calls I didn't answer, emails I didn't open. I wasn't shocked. He'd done it before, taken something I built and used it for his protection. The difference now was simple. I wasn't 19, I wasn't dependent, and I wasn't alone. I forwarded the article to legal. I attached the signed plea agreement, the confidentiality clause, and the penalty for defamation. Then I closed the laptop, sat back in my chair, and exhaled. He thought this was still a game. It wasn't. The firm responded within the hour. The breach of confidentiality clause was clear, the plea deal now compromised, and the DA's office was preparing to reopen discussions under stricter terms. He had traded leniency for attention, and all he got in return was a sharper spotlight. My team prepared the paperwork to withdraw our representation, citing conflict of interest. It wasn't dramatic, just protocol. His public statement had violated the terms, and that gave us leverage we hadn't planned for. I didn't reach out to him. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to salvage, just consequences waiting for him. He must have realized quickly what he'd done. The press frenzy died within 2 days, replaced by legal commentary about ethics and court violations. His new attorney filed motions to repair the damage, but the prosecution held firm. The plea deal was revoked. The full sentence was back on the table. He tried to argue for bias, but there was nothing to support his claim, no misconduct, no evidence, just his own arrogance printed in bold. His face, once polished and persuasive, now filled news segments titled From Rising Star to Federal Defendant. The fall was complete. Meanwhile, my firm received a wave of support. Clients sent flowers, colleagues sent messages. The team, loyal and quiet, stayed focused. We never made a statement, never answered questions, never confirmed or denied. I told them we didn't need to win the internet, we just needed to stay ready. Behind closed doors, I reviewed the files again, looked through years of signatures, emails, patterns. He hadn't just made mistakes. He'd learned the system to break it, used the same ambition I once admired to dismantle people's lives. He didn't stumble. He strategized. That made all the difference. What the public didn't know was that the money he embezzled had already been partially tracked to an offshore account, one opened under a company registered in my mother's name. The same mother who had disappeared, emptied accounts, and left him drowning alone. Whether he knew or not, whether he was complicit or just foolish, didn't matter anymore. Legally, he bore the weight. His name was on the filings. His signature sat beneath the withdrawals. Her name was a ghost, untouchable, untraceable. The irony was sharp. He married her for power. She left him holding the wreckage. I don't know where she went. The last sighting was in Morocco, on a yacht rented through a shell company. I didn't chase her. I didn't need to. She'd made her choice, and so had I. He was now the face of the scandal, the poster child for what happens when ambition feeds on loyalty. I attended one hearing after his breach, not to speak, not to testify, just to watch. He didn't look up when I entered. Didn't flinch. Just stared forward as the charges were read again, this time with the word intentional replacing negligent. That word sealed everything. His attorney tried to delay sentencing, argued mental strain, stress, emotional confusion. The judge wasn't moved. The court set a new date. I walked out of that building with no cameras following, no questions shouted, just the steady echo of heels on tile. I didn't feel victorious. I felt done. There's a difference between revenge and resolution. I wasn't chasing either. I had already survived everything he tried to bury me with. The rest was just paperwork. Let the world think what it wanted. Let him explain it however he could. I had nothing more to give this story. Back at the office, I deleted his folder. Archived the case. Told my team to reassign his files to another handler. They didn't ask why. They knew. We went back to work, real work, helping tenants keep homes, helping women escape contracts they didn't understand. That's the part no one prints, the steady labor after the storm. The real wins don't come in headlines. They come in silence, in not having to explain yourself anymore. I didn't need an audience. I had my name, my firm, and peace. That was more than enough. Sometimes, people ask what happened to him. I say he pled guilty. I don't add that he once said he couldn't have made it without me. I don't mention the wedding or the earrings or the borrowed house keys. I just say he made his decisions. Then I change the subject. Not because it hurts, but because it doesn't. That's the part they never understand. Not every scar's visible. Some just stop bleeding quietly. And if you're lucky, you don't even feel them anymore. The morning of his sentencing was overcast, the sky hanging low like it was holding its breath. I wasn't required to be there, but I went anyway, not out of spite, not for closure, just to witness the final shape of a story I once lived in. The courtroom wasn't crowded. No press. No family. Just attorneys, court clerks, and one man in a suit that no longer fit him. He didn't look at me when I entered, didn't acknowledge my presence. That was fine. Some endings don't need words. Some are just the quiet unraveling of a once loud life. The judge read the summary slowly, each word a weight, each sentence a reminder that no title, no degree, no polished resume could clean the stains left behind. The financial damage was extensive, the betrayal deliberate, the victims many. There was no room left for negotiation, no space for performance. His attorney tried once more to argue for leniency, citing stress, misguidance, emotional trauma. But the courtroom didn't move. The people watching didn't blink. The judge wasn't interested in apologies rehearsed too late. She lowered her glasses, looked him dead in the eye, and asked, "Is there anything you'd like to say?" He stood, adjusted the cuffs on his sleeves like he still believed in appearances. For a moment, I wondered if he'd try again, if he'd reach for charm, spin regret into something softer. But he didn't. He said he was sorry. Said he made mistakes. Said he thought he could control the damage before it swallowed him. He didn't mention names. Not mine. Not hers. Just guilt in abstract. I could tell it wasn't for the victims. It wasn't for the law. It was for himself, for the version of him he could no longer pretend to be. The sentence was read without ceremony. 7 years, no parole. Fines exceeding $500,000. Professional disbarment. Immediate custody. The bailiff stepped forward. No handcuffs, just a quiet nod, and he followed. No resistance. No final glance. Just movement. I didn't flinch. I didn't lean forward. I just watched. Not out of vengeance, but clarity. The man I once bled for was no longer standing there. That version of him had died long before this courtroom, long before the headlines. What stood there now was the echo, the residue of ambition that forgot where it came from. Afterwards, I walked the courthouse steps slowly. Reporters waited outside, but they weren't there for him. Another case was drawing the spotlight now. I passed by without notice, like any other professional in a suit. It felt fitting. After all the noise, all the betrayal, this part was quiet. The justice wasn't loud. It didn't arrive in flames or fury. It came in formality, in signatures, in sentences read aloud by people who never knew the whole story. That's how it should be. Some wounds don't need to be paraded. Some victories don't need to be witnessed. Later that week, his new attorney reached out. Apparently, there was a letter. Written before sentencing. Not to the court. Not to the media. To me. I didn't want it, but I accepted. The envelope was thick, the handwriting familiar, slanted, rushed. Inside was confession, justification, fragments of a man who still didn't fully understand what he destroyed. He blamed her, blamed pressure, even blamed his own love for me. Said he married her because he felt unworthy of me, like distance was protection. The logic was broken, as always. Love shouldn't require disappearing. Protection doesn't come with betrayal. I didn't respond. I shredded the letter without finishing it. Not out of anger, not to prove anything, just because it didn't belong in my life anymore. He could keep the narrative. Let him spin his legacy out of falsehoods if it helped him sleep. I had no interest in correcting his version. The truth didn't need my defense. I had already lived it, survived it, built something in spite of it. That was enough. He had written his ending the moment he chose to betray the hand that fed him. All I did was let it reach its final page. Some nights, I still see their faces, not in nightmares, just in memory. The woman who raised me, the man I built, both sitting at a table I no longer eat at. I don't wish them harm. I don't wish them anything. Indifference is its own kind of peace. People ask if I'd do it all differently. Maybe. But then again, maybe not. Some fires burn clean. Some scars don't itch. And, sometimes, becoming who you are means surviving who they were without bitterness, without apology, without ever needing to look back. 3 months passed before I heard his name again. It came through a colleague's forwarded email, a clip from a podcast that had gained traction online. They were dissecting his fall, or rather, reframing it. The host, a soft-spoken man with a taste for scandal, introduced the episode as the untold story of a fallen lawyer. But it wasn't untold. It was rewritten. They called him a misunderstood genius, hinted that he was targeted by a former lover turned legal shark. They didn't say my name, but the breadcrumbs were there, enough to shift suspicion without confirming anything outright. He'd found a way to make himself a victim again. From prison, through proxies, through half-truths, he let the world believe he was punished not for fraud, but for love gone wrong. I could have responded. Released documents. Leaked the letter. Corrected the record. But I didn't. I watched quietly as a false story bloomed, as sympathy tilted back in his favor. The same people who once distanced themselves began sharing posts about redemption, about second chances. It was familiar, his charm, even filtered through prison walls, still worked. He didn't need freedom to manipulate. He just needed an audience. The most painful part wasn't the lie. It was how quickly people embraced it. They didn't care about the victims, didn't read the files, didn't ask for proof. They just wanted a story with clean lines, a villain, a heroine, a tragic twist. I became the shadowy figure, the bitter ex, the woman who couldn't let go. They didn't know the hours I worked to keep clients in their homes, the kids I helped avoid detention, the silence I kept to protect people who'd never protect me in return. All they saw was the echo of a man who never deserved the stage. My firm received anonymous threats, slurs buried in emails, reviews written by accounts with no photos. It didn't escalate, but it lingered. A slow leak of doubt. Some clients asked questions. Not many, but enough to notice. I considered stepping back, letting someone else take lead on public cases. Then I remembered something my first professor said, that integrity isn't loud. It's consistent. So I stayed. I answered questions. I showed up to court. I wore the same black suit I always wore, not to make a point, but because the work didn't change, even when the story did. Behind the scenes, I quietly prepared my response. Not for the public, not for the press, for the legal board. The breach of plea terms, the false accusations, the slander. It wasn't revenge. It was responsibility. I compiled everything. The letter, the podcast transcript, the media pattern. I didn't plan to ruin him. I just wanted to remove the platform he'd stolen. He wasn't telling his truth. He was selling a lie. And even in prison, even through microphones and sympathy, he was still trying to weaponize what little I had left untouched. That I couldn't allow. The board moved quickly. They began a formal review, not just of the slander, but of his earlier filings. A pattern emerged not just in his case, but in how he'd conducted himself even before the fraud. Old clients came forward. Former interns. Even one former partner who admitted she'd signed off on deals under pressure. His legacy, once thin but polished, began to unravel in public. Not because I exposed him. Because the people he used no longer had a reason to protect him. His story didn't collapse. It expired. Slowly, quietly, until it was just dust. One night, I received a letter, not from him, but from another inmate. A stranger. She said he told stories about me. Said I ruined his life. Said I'd been obsessed with him since college. She didn't believe him, but wanted to warn me. Said he still talked like I owed him something. That's when it hit me. He didn't just lose everything. He believed I took it from him. That I was the reason he fell. Not his decisions. Not his theft. Me. That belief was his last shield, his last grip on a version of himself he could live with. I folded the letter and placed it in the same drawer where I kept the shredded one. Not as a keepsake, but as a reminder. That some people never change, even when the walls close in. That to some men, power is never something they lose, it's always something stolen from them. I didn't cry. I didn't flinch. I just locked the drawer and turned off the light. Not out of peace, but because I had court in the morning. And his story, whatever version he was telling now, had finally stopped following me into the room. It wasn't the podcast or the letters or the smear that finally ended him. It was a line in the original plea deal, the one he signed without reading carefully. Paragraph 6, Section C, public statements in contradiction to agreed facts would result in immediate sentence review and revocation of all credit for cooperation. His little story, dressed in betrayal and performance, triggered that clause like a trapdoor. The prosecutor filed swiftly. New hearings were scheduled. His sentence could now be extended. He hadn't just burned the bridge, he'd stood on it while striking the match. When his attorney tried to argue misinterpretation, the court responded with silence. The plea deal had been fair, negotiated, agreed upon, and witnessed. It wasn't coercion. It was paperwork. He'd gambled with the only mercy the system offered and lost. I didn't celebrate. There was no toast. Just a quiet evening reviewing case files while the storm he'd made swallowed him again. This time, no one reached out to defend him. The podcast deleted the episode. His name was removed from firm alumni pages. What remained was a cautionary tale, not of ambition, but of arrogance. I didn't attend the second sentencing. I already knew how it would end. Not with chains or headlines, but with absence. He would fade into years, into numbers, into that quiet place where stories lose traction. I moved forward. New cases. New clients. The world kept turning, and I let it. Sometimes, I'd walk past old bookstores, hear the rustle of someone flipping pages, and wonder if he ever wrote about me in those letters he gave to other inmates. If he still spun versions of me where I was the villain. It didn't matter. Nobody was reading anymore. I visited my old house once, the one with the repainted door and trimmed hedges. A different family lives there now. Kids' shoes on the porch, laughter echoing from inside. I didn't go in. Just stood across the street, long enough to remember, then long enough to let go. That place was never really mine. It was a resting stop between storms. My real home is made of decisions, not walls. Of silence that I chose, not silence forced on me. He tried to define me by what I lost. But the truth is, he only ever touched the surface. A junior associate at my firm once asked if the story was true, the rumors, the headlines, the betrayal. I smiled, asked her if it mattered. She said yes. Said it made her believe you could survive anything and still be elegant. I didn't answer. Just passed her the next file and told her to focus. Survival isn't magic. It's math. You subtract what doesn't serve you until all that's left is clean. You don't rise. You rebuild. Quietly. On purpose. With precision. And when people ask how, you tell them it wasn't pretty. It was necessary. The last I heard, my mother resurfaced in Bali under a different name. I didn't investigate. Whatever she took, she can keep. That version of her no longer exists in my world. If I saw her on the street, I don't know if I'd speak. Not out of hate, but because some bonds decay too far to salvage. She made her choices. And in the end, the man she chose over me dragged her name through the same dirt she helped him collect. Loyalty, for her, was currency. And now, it's worth nothing. As for him, he still writes letters. Not to me. To editors, to podcasts, to whatever platform still gives him breath. Most go unanswered. The world has moved on. I don't read them. But I do keep the final clause of his plea printed and pinned behind my office door. Not as a trophy, but a reminder. Words have weight. Promises have structure. And mercy, when given without respect, becomes a weapon turned backward. He tried to rewrite the ending. I just made sure the ink dried first. Subscribe to Letters to Ray Studio, where stories cut deep. Justice is served cold. And no betrayal goes unanswered. Like, comment, and share if you know someone who needs to hear this. Because some stories aren't just told. They're survived.